Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back to Global Business Management, lecture number 13. This lecture will be most probably divided into two, if not three sections, and we will try to understand political economy and international trade. In previous lectures, I've talked about in detail about the political economy of a country. So it's going to be a broader scale. Right now, idea is the same, that political economy is combination of three elements, that is your legal, government system, legal system, and economic system of the company. So now we are expanding out to international level. So let's start the lecture. Now first try to understand what we mean by free trade. It is basically a situation where a government does not attempt to restrict when its citizens can buy from another country or what they can sell to another country, simply put. While many nations are nominally committed to free trade, they tend to intervene in international trade to protect the interest of politically important groups. Now, let's try to identify the tools through which a government can intervene in international trade. Uh, there are seven tools, but they are not limited to seven tools. That is, tariffs can be introduced or subsidies can be provided to local manufacturers or import quotas can be imposed, and voluntarily exports restraints can be implemented with reference to national and geopolitical interest of the country, or the government will force the foreign investors or producers to respect and adapt the local content requirements. And then we have anti-dumping policies which can be administered at different stages of a business, or administrative policies as it. Well, these are the possible tools through which a government can intervene. So let's try to have a look on tariffs. That is a tax levied on imports that effectively raise the cost of imported products relative to domestic products. That is, specific tariffs are levied as a fixed charge for each unit of a goods import, or another type is ad valorem tariffs, are levied as a portion of the value of imported goods. So the question comes, why government want to impose the tariffs? Of course, it helps government to collect their revenue, as well as provide protection to the domestic businesses or producers with reference to foreign competition. And at the same time, it forces consumers to pay more for certain imports, and ultimately which will result as tariffs are unambiguously pro-producer and anti-consumer. And tariffs reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy. Another tool which a government can utilize to intervene in international trade is subsidy, that is a government payment to a domestic producer. Subsidies help domestic producers to compete against low-cost foreign imports or gain export markets, and consumer typically absorb the cost of subsidies. Now let's try to identify different import quotas which governments try to implement. That is, import quota, a direct restriction on the quantity of some goods that may be imported into a country, or trade tariff quotas, which is a hybrid of quota and a tariff, where a low tariff is applied to imports within the quota than to the overall quota. And voluntarily export restraints are quotas on trade imposed by exporting country, typically at the request of importing countries, host the government. And quota rent, that is extra profit that producers make when supply is artificially limited by import quotas. So let's try to identify what are the benefits of import quota and voluntarily export restraints. Import quota and voluntarily export restraints benefit domestic producers by limiting import competition, but they raise the price of imported goods for consumers. So a local content requirement is the next tool which a government can utilize to intervene in international trade. That is, demands the specific fraction of goods to be produced domestically, which can be in a physical terms or in a value terms. So local content requirements benefit domestic producers and jobs, but consumers pay high prices. Next one is administrative trade policies, that is bureaucratic rules that are designed to make it difficult for imports to enter in a country. These policies hurt consumer by denying access to possible superior foreign products. And second last tool which a government rely on is dumping or anti-dumping. That is, dumping is selling goods in a foreign market below the cost of production or selling goods in a foreign market and below their fair market value. This is a way for firms to unload excess production in foreign markets, or maybe predatory behavior with producers using substantial outputs or profits from their home markets to subsidize prices in a foreign market with a view to driving indigenous competitors out of the market. So, as a result, governments will intervene and introduce anti-dumping policies that is designed to punish foreign firms that engage in dumping. And here goal is to protect domestic producers from unfair foreign competition. So US firms that believe a foreign firm is dumping can file a complaint with the government. And if the complaint has merit, anti-dumping duties, also known as countervailing duties, may be imposed. So let's try to understand why government will intervene in international trade by utilizing those 7 tools. One is political argument, and second one is economic arguments. Political arguments concerned with protecting the interest of certain groups within a national, that is normally producer, often at the expense of other groups, that is normally consumers. So economic interest argument is concerned with the boosting the overall wealth of a nation, that is to benefit all, both producers and consumers. So politically, uh, one objective of the government can be to protect jobs, protecting industries deemed important for national securities, or relating to unfair foreign competition, or protecting consumers from dangerous products as per the definition of government's administrative policies, or retaliating to unfair foreign competition, furthering the goals of foreign policy, or protecting the human rights of individual and exporting countries. Um, when you talk about political arguments for government's intervention in international trade, the very first one is protecting jobs and industries. The most common political reason for trade restriction is to typically the result of political pressures by unions or industries that are threatened by more efficient foreign producers. Or it can be national security. So governments protect certain industries such as aerospace and advanced electronics because they are important for national security. Or government can intervene as a retaliation to the actions of a foreign government. When governments take or threaten to take specific actions, other countries may remove trade barriers. That can be risky strategy. If threatened, government don't back down. Tensions can escalate and new trade barriers may be introduced. Or protecting the consumer in another justification by the government to intervene the international trade, that is protecting consumer from unsafe product, is also by an argument for restricting imports, which often involves limiting or banning the import of certain products. So, another objective, the fifth one can be to further extend the foreign policy objectives. So, trade can help out. और उसके अंदर फिर अमेरिकन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हमारे पास हेल्म्स बर्टन एक्ट एंड द अमाउंटो एक्ट है with reference to. And the next argument or the last argument a government can justify their intervention in international trade is protecting human rights, where governments can use trade policies to improve the human rights policies of trading partner. Some critics have argued that the best way to change the internal human rights of a country is to engage in international trade, which will ultimately result the decision to grant China most favored nation status in 1999 was based on this policy philosophy by American government. Another or second component of government intervention is economic arguments. That is, government want to protect the infant industry or it's part of a strategic trade policy, so government have to intervene in the business. Infant industry arguments suggest that an industry should be protected until it can develop and be viable and competitive at its own at international levels. However, this argument has been criticized because it is useless unless it makes the industry more efficient, or if a country has a potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firms should be capable of raising necessary funds. So strategic trade policy suggests that in cases where there may be important first mover advantages, governments can help firms from their countries attain those advantages. And it also suggests that governments can help firms overcome barriers to entry into industries where foreign markets or firms have an initial advantage. So, what is the case for revised case for trade, free trade? That is, new trade theorists believe government intervention in international trade is justified. That is, which contradicts the classical trade theories. Some new trade theorists believe that while strategic trade theory is applying in theory, it may not be workable in practice. So they suggested a revised case for free trade. So there are two situations where restrictions on trade may be inappropriate when a government wants to retaliate or they want to develop the domestic policies of a government. When retaliation is the objective of a government and they try to intervene in international trade, so as per Krugman, strategic trade policies aimed at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry are bigger than neighborhood policies that boost national income at the expense of other countries. A country that attempts to use such policies will probably provoke retaliation. That is, a trade war could leave both countries worse off. Excuse me. Second component of intervention is domestic policies or government can be influenced by special interests, that is interest groups. Those interest groups can be limited to but can be expanded to consumers, producers, public organizations, private organizations, advocacy groups, lobbying groups. So a government's decision to intervene in a market may appease a certain group, but not necessarily the support the interest of a country as a whole. So let's try to identify after since World War II, an international trading framework has evolved to govern over world trade. In its first 50 years, the framework was known as the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that is GATT. Since 1995, the framework has now been known as the World Trade Organization. From Adam Smith to the Great Depression of 1930s, most countries have some degree of protectionism. That is, the US enacted the Smooth-Hawley Act 1930, created significant import tariffs on foreign goods. Other nations took similar steps, and as the depression deepened, world trade fell further. What happened between 1947 to 1979? That is, the General Agreement on Trade Tariff was established in 1947. The approach of GATT was to gradually eliminate barriers to trade. So GATT membership grew from 19 to more than 120 nations today. Tariff reduction was spread over 8 rounds of negotiations, and GATT regulations were enforced by a mutual monetary system. The world trading system came under strain during the 1980s and early 90s because Japan's economic success strained what have been more equal trading patterns. Persistent trade deficits by the US government or US caused significant problems in some industries and political problems. And many countries found that although GATT limited the use of tariffs, there were many other forms of interventions that had the same effect, that it did not technically violate GATT. Excuse me. In 1986 Uruguay round, it focused on service and intellectual property protection, and the World Trade Organization was established as a more effective policeman of the global trade, and WTO encompassed GATT and the General Agreement on Trade in Services and the Agreement on Trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, that is known as TRIPS. So what is the experience of WTO till today? Uh, WTO has emerged as an effective advocate and facilitator of future trade deals. So far, most countries have adopted WTO recommendations for their trade disputes. The WTO has brokered negotiation to reform the global telecommunication and financial services and industries. What is the future of WTO? That is currently focusing on anti-dumping policies को revise करना, protectionism with reference to agriculture को protect करना, and protecting intellectual properties. Followed by market access for non-agriculture goods and services and new round of talks that happened in Dhaka.
where focus was on cutting tariffs on industrial goods and services and phasing out subsidies to agriculture producers and reduce barriers to cross-border investment. So what are the implications for manager? Trade barriers impact firm strategy at corporate and strategic decision level, and firms can play a role in monitoring free trade or trade barriers. So let's try to understand the relationship between trade barriers and firm strategy. Trade theory suggests while dispersing production activities globally can be beneficial, however, trade barriers may limit a firm's ability to do so, and all of these can be raise cost above what they may have been in a world of free trade. Policy implications for managers in a firm. International firms have an incentive to lobby for free trade and keep protectionism pressures from causing them to have change strategies. While there may be short-run benefits to having government protection in some situations, in the long run, they can backfire and other governments can retaliate, making it more difficult to construct a globally dispersed production systems for company in question. This concludes our this chapter and इंशाल्लाह आपसे बात होगी हमारा जो अगला इंटरेक्टिव सेशन है अपना ख्याल रखिएगा टिल देन अल्लाह हाफिज